Good morning, everyone. My name's Ian Hall. I'm the Associate Dean for Conferences. I think we've just been told to always look on the bright side of life, so that's quite a good motto anyway. I just want to say one thing about the Congress. If you've got any ideas about it, do come and speak to me, but also our call for suggestions for next year opens on the 22nd of July, so if you've got a really good idea that it will be great in conference next year, please let us know. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr David Halpern, who's Chief Executive of the Behavioural Insights team, or the so-called nudge unit, so nudging people to change their behaviour rather than doing it in a more aggressive or assertive way. He was previously the founding director of the Institute for Government, and from 2001 to 2007, he was the chief analyst at the Prime Minister's strategy unit at a time when things could only get better. Before that, he was a proper academic, working at Oxford, Harvard, and luckily Cambridge. And so I'm delighted to be able to introduce his talk on behavioural insights and mental health. Thank you.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here. I should say it was also nice to hear Professor Chest's presentation just now. It's my 50th birthday yesterday, so I was very pleased to hear that brain plasticity is alive and well. So what I was going to try and do today is just quickly go through, give you a sense of what it is we've been doing in recent years in essentially trying to bring psychology into policy making more fundamentally. I'm going to give you a glimpse into some just quick examples. I'm going to go through a few. Actually, I was also, hopefully, a way we'll follow on from the previous session and talk a bit about well-being as well. So here we go. I thought I'd mention, actually, I did my PhD, albeit a long time ago now, it seems like, on mental health and actually specifically the built environment. Actually, it was a particular interest also of Hugh Freeman, some may remember, who was editor of British Journal of Psychiatry for a long time. So it's quite nice to be back here and actually reflect on some of these issues again. But just briefly to remind ourselves what some of that taught us, certainly as policymakers going forward, is that social networks, as we heard, are extraordinarily consequential, and sometimes we've been quite neglectful of them sometimes. Famously or infamously, in the slum clearance programs that were popular on both sides of the Atlantic. This actually is a shot from an area in the West End of Boston, famously studied by Herbert Gans. That was before, and that was after. People were found, I think, between a quarter and a third of the population were suffering from clinical depression, those who had been there even 3 years on. It's incredibly destructive because essentially we were neglectful, which is collectively, of the importance of social networks. And just because somewhere looked physically a bit tatty didn't mean there wasn't something of enormous value. In fact, we know that even the threat of demolition and destruction can have huge impacts on people's well-being. This is just a plot from a study I did at a similar time in the UK, which was looking at essentially an odds ratio of how often people go to see their GP from an area in the UK, actually up in Runcorn, which became threatened by demolition, controlling for seasonal variations and relative to other populations. And you can see, as the announcement was made as a state that 2,000 people was going to be demolished, you see these significant increases in GP consultations for a whole range of things, not just psychosomatic actually, overtly. Then it turned out, this way was interesting, is that the decision was reversed, or appeared to be reversed, in all the local newspapers and so on, with report from the then Secretary of State, then was subsequently reconfirmed. And you can see the essentially consultation rates cleaned up, going up and down with, with the actual events. You might think about what's happening across the UK now in some communities with the current uncertainty. And more generally, I think we found that there are interesting lessons about how the physical environment can shape people's social networks and in turn affect their mental health. This is actually a Google shot you see of an area in a state where I spent one time in that period, with one other number, looking at physical alterations to the estate. How well you can see it. It's what architects call a Radburn layout or design. So these estates were designed to be safe, so that the vehicles would go around the backs of the houses and you have these green spaces to the front. on the face of it, a very nice place to be. What actually happened is in those green spaces is that because you could cut through these estates, if you saw someone outside, you didn't know if they were a neighbour or a stranger. And essentially, it drives a behaviour of withdrawal. You know, when you're being on the underground with lots of other people, you don't feel wonderful about your fellow human beings and wish to hug them, even if you are closely embrace them. So similarly, what we found is that by changing the way in which people could flow through these estates, essentially to shut down some of the alleyways and reduce some of the routes through, you saw this domino consequence over a 2-year period of greater social interaction between the residents, and also significant reductions on depression and anxiety as measured by the HAD scale over that period. And it was mediated substantially by the sense of you suddenly came to know who your neighbour was. As Frost said, good fences make good neighbours. The ability to regulate your social interactions leads to more positive consequences. Right, now jumping forward to the current day, or recent days, in the wake of the 2010 election, Cameron and Clegg had this thing in the coalition agreement. Our government will find intelligent ways to encourage, support and enable people to make better choices for themselves. The idea essentially was to use some psychology, you might say, behavioural insights more broadly, as an alternative to traditional regulation or just using incentives. The most famous example many are familiar with is the change in defaults that came in a couple of years ago in pensions. Just to give you a sense of the power of that effect, I mean, just making that one seemingly small change, as in you still have a choice, but now you tell your employer if you want to opt out rather than opt in. More than 90% of eligible are found to opt in. It's an absolutely massive effect. As opposed to our traditional instrument is using a tax subsidy, which costs billions. We literally spend tens of billions. But which our best estimate of the effect size of those billions, for every extra pound of tax subsidy, you get 1p of extra saving. As opposed to changing the default, as essentially more than 90% of eligible stick and start saving for a pension. So you can read about some of this stuff if you want to. We try and put it in the public domain, it's a book recently, or you can look at our website. I just thought I'd give you a quick glimpse into some of these kind of most basic approaches that sometimes uses mnemonic EAST to affect behaviour, make it easy, attractive, social, timely. Just very quickly some examples. To make it easy, you might not think this is require a PhD or be an expert in psychiatry to work this out, but it's incredibly consequential. A famous example close to your area is suicide. So some of you will know the suicide rates started dropping in the late 1950s in the UK. Quite spectacular actually for both men and women. There was much discussion over those periods as it stopped more or less dropping in 7 years in a row as to what was going on. Was it free love and so on and so on? Actually it was the discovery of North Sea oil. Because one of the primary reasons people used to kill themselves is put their head in the oven and it would kill you because of carbon monoxide. Well, with the discovery of North Sea oil, natural gas so-called had less carbon monoxide. And hey presto, that's what you see happening with the suicides as a relation to carbon monoxide poisoning versus others. You see very little substitution across. So if you think friction, a small amount of extra friction, a bit more difficult to kill yourself, will affect kind of the most important decision in your life. It turns out to affect almost everything else too. A very simple clinical example, make it easy for clinicians and prescription charts to be able to write in a way that other people could read. You know doctors have bad writing. And it's incredibly consequential. Is this dosage milligram or microgram? So just simply changing charts to reduce errors has a huge impact. Make it easy. Make it attractive. What does this mean in psychological terms? Well, I'll just show you one example for getting people back to work faster, many of them. But you can use personalisation. So we noticed, for example, that people who we'd asked to turn up to an appointment, in this case an appointment for a job interview in job centres, only about 1 in 10 would actually turn up to this booked interview. There's a job fair on such a Saturday, you've been booked a place. If you add the person's name, so we said Ian, and add that into the text received, you can see it jumps up by 5 percentage points or 50%. If I add my name as well, so Ian, you booked a place, and so on, David, now we're at 18%. If we add one more line in, so we say, Ian, I've booked you a place, la 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 la, good luck, David, now 27%. Of course, the cost involved is almost nothing, but it actually is quite transformative in terms of impact. You might also say, how does that person feel when they turn up for that job interview with that kind of, as opposed to a text, more personalised as opposed to just a generic. Social, of course, incredibly influenced by other people. And this is true for huge areas of things that are policy relevant. I'll just show you one recent one published in The Lancet. It turns out even clinicians are affected by what other people are doing. And then we should show you two studies. This is to do with antimicrobial resistance. We're trying to get GPs and others to prescribe less if they're not necessary. And indeed, patients will ask less ideally. So I'll show you, actually, it turned out that the department was going to run a big campaign. It did run a big campaign. We managed to persuade them to do it as a randomized controlled trial. Kind of classic stuff. You can see that they, go into a GP practice, big posters like this. Big posters and little posters, and they've got handouts as well, and kind of leaflets telling you about how to treat your infection, you can give to patients and so on, and information for GPs. Randomized controlled trial does absolutely nothing. Turns out it does absolutely nothing. So we thought we'd try one other thing, which is to, in parallel, we get the chief medical officer to write to GPs and just tell them something which is true. So we identify that the top 20% of prescribers, in terms of GPs across the UK, we split them in half in a randomized controlled trial, and we send them a letter from Sally Davis. And it basically says, you just might want to know, you prescribe more than 80% of other GPs in terms of antibiotics. Because it might be you have very sick patients. And then we also gave you some ideas about things you might do, like just give someone a delayed prescription. If you're not feeling well in 2 days' time, then use it, but otherwise don't. Would it make a difference? Randomized controlled trial, so we've got to take out the seasonal variation. That's the control group, the other half, the 20%. And then there goes the letter, and you can see we follow it for 6 months, see a persistent reduction in prescriptions of antibiotics. It's just under a 4% reduction, which is quite big. Just to check then at the end, at 6 months, we send a letter to the other half of the sample, and there you can see it converging. So across the UK, that's equivalent to a 0.85% reduction in antibiotic prescription. The department's target for the entire year was 1% reduction by sending one letter. And what other people do? Timely, it matters what you do when. It's just one very simple example. We're trying to get people to stay on in education. Young people often drop out. Again, in this case, just using simple text interventions, we look at when people drop out. So quite often, at the end of the holiday, a lot of young people don't come back. So we send them a text saying, really looking forward to seeing you, using some implementation intention, don't forget to plan your way back in, etc. Or motivational prompts. You might be finding it very difficult at the moment. People often do at this point in the course. In a week or two, you'll be feeling much better about it. Whereas due to dropout rates, there's a control group, there's our treatment group. And the cost is literally a few p. Okay, I wanted to just pivot now onto the issue of well-being, not least to follow on in fact what we just heard. So one of the interests, certainly for behavioural scientists also, has been about what is it that drives well-being. And one of the reasons it drives this overlap is that it turns out the same mental shortcuts that drive other kinds of behaviour also affect big choices in life. So we don't really remember exactly what made us happy. When we come back from our holiday and someone says, did you have a good time? So, yeah, it was great. If you look at a diary study, documenting what was happening with the kids and the rain and everything else, it's not so obvious. We also systematically mispredict what will make us happy in the future too. We can look cross-nationally. One of the fascinating things is that quite big national differences as well. So this is life satisfaction against GDP per capita. And you can see, fortunately, there is a relationship, which is quite good to know, generally rising, but also diminishing returns. You can see a whole clutch where the UK, I'll just show you there, the little red spot, that's the UK in 2010. And we're not doing badly, although, of course, look at Denmark up above. Denmark has got very high levels of life satisfaction and also been increasing over the last 30 years as well. So in the last 10 years, we have been catching them up a bit, but they're still way ahead. So what are they doing? And what might we do about this? Well, it was something also that BM was interested in saying about, if this matters, if it's more than economic growth we're trying to achieve as a society, well, we should do something about it. And one place to start was just to measure it, actually, simply to measure it. So we asked the Office of National Statistics to come up with measures. A long time was spent. Many of you may have been involved in some of those questions. We ended up with these 4 measures now done on quite large sample sizes. 100,000 to 200,000 people a year now being asked in Britain. And you can see a range of questions. One is a so-called evaluative measure, life satisfaction. 2 of them you can see are affective measures around how did you feel yesterday, how happy did you feel yesterday, how anxious. And then the last one, interesting, is so-called eudaimonic measure, which is to what extent do you think the things that you do in your life are worthwhile? And one of the things that drives us, we know from other kinds of data, like if you're trying to get your kids to do their homework and you ask people how you're feeling, they don't normally say that happy about it. Or carers, of course, may not feel happy about it, but they do feel what they're doing is worthwhile. So we thought that important to measure. It's the key question, if you measure, can you do anything about it? And what drives it? Well, I showed you the Danish data. So an interesting thing to do, it turns out, is just ask the Danes, as has been done for other countries, well, what do you think is the core, root of well-being or happiness? And they seem to be pretty good at it. Those are some Danish people, by the way, apparently. And what they're asked to do is rank this, and I've ranked the answers according to the Danish responses. It's been done across the EU. And you can see they say actually the top thing they rank is love. Well, we know that sort of makes sense. But I'll tell you what's really surprising. The Danes are the only country that have that as their top answer. Here, by the way, in contrast, that's the UK. You see? We're a bit more concerned about a few other things. We don't care much about love and solidarity. We do care quite a lot about money, it turns out, in terms of our formula. Well, is that right? Actually, I'll also show you the most miserable Europeans. If you know who they are, you can speculate. I'll show you in a second. This is their answers. You see, a bit like the UK, but much more extreme, actually. So putting much more emphasis on sort of material issues, work, money, and so on, and less on the relational. Turns out, looks like that's the wrong answer. That's Bulgaria, by the way. If we use other kinds of data and do more conventional regressions, of course it tells us a very similar story. This is just some stuff from just UK longitudinal data. These are some of the things that drive it. I won't go through them all, but one of the surprises people often find is that Northern Ireland does pretty well on life satisfaction compared to other regions. Which often surprises people, but of course most people's experience of life in Northern Ireland on a day-to-day basis is living in a very strong, cohesive community. Similarly, you can see the effects of volunteering in there. Strong negative effects, of course, of being, there's issues to do with being married or not, and turns out to what extent is it also driven by your personal characteristics, I'll get into that, but being unemployed, unpaid carers, etc. Also one thing in there about even not trusting other people being quite a powerful variable. The main point is relationships matter hugely for our well-being. Can we do anything about it? Finally. Well, we think so. So one area we're certainly interested in, many people are interested, is can we expand certain kinds of interventions more closely to the clinical ones? So can we, to what scale can we get digitally assisted CBT operating? If we can increase, we believe David Clark's work, that with similar kind of efficacy, but increase the productivity of our clinical psychologists by 5-fold, it becomes possible to use CBT and other IACT approaches for much larger populations. So that's certainly one area of great interest. Can we go much earlier? I mean, one of the most interesting areas I think at the moment is efforts to promote essentially soft skills or non-cognitive skills and resilience in particular in young people. Is it possible? We think so. It also looks like it mediates a lot of the social differentials in later outcomes on earnings and other types of outcomes too. And yet at the moment we've never really measured it or taken seriously in much of our education system. This will be a major focus of activity for us in the next couple of years. Other interventions, one of the reasons behind National Citizen Service was of course volunteering, also deliberately including social mixing across groups as well. One of the things we did with the NCS program is we also tracked essentially it's not clean, a perfect, pragmatic design, but look at the impacts compared to controls of doing the program. And you can see on these are the 4 measures, and you can see on 3 of the well-being measures, you see significant increases in young people who go through National Citizen Service. Not the only reason why you should do it, but it's pretty striking that it works in that way. Social trust, I mentioned very briefly. So this is a very simple question. In fact, you can almost ask yourself now, maybe I'll do a show of hands. This is a question you've been asking since the 1950s in some countries. It's very simple. Generally speaking, do you think other people can be trusted? And the answer either yes or no, can't be too careful. Maybe I'm just asking, how many people would say yes to that question? And how many would say no, can't be too careful? That makes you a really weird group, I think. So in the UK population now, it's actually about 30%. And you probably were close to 90%. It's good for you. It's good to live in a world where you think other people can be trusted. Huge differences. So this graph shows you what levels of social trust in the early 1980s versus in the more recent data. You can see Great Britain, if you're on the bottom, underneath this line, you're drifting towards lower social trust, which we are with other Anglo-Saxon countries. We have other countries where less than 10% of people would say most can be trusted. We We also have countries like, of course, the Nordics, famously, where you see incredibly high levels of social trust. 60 or 70% of people say most others can be trusted. Incredibly consequential. It affects your economic growth rate. This question is a better predictor of national growth rates than levels of human capital in a population. We have huge departments for education and skills. We don't have a department for making people trust each other, let alone the impact, of course, on well-being, which we see substantial. Other effects, even the physical environment, which I mentioned earlier, can have significant effects. This is a micro study, a wonderful study, one of my favourite actually in this area. On student accommodation, if you think about the accommodation you lived in, it's contrasting two designs. One is a traditional corridor design. How many people lived in something like that? Long corridors, big block of toilets and so on. I certainly did as a graduate. It's very efficient. If you want to go and brush your teeth in the morning, pretty unlikely all the stools will be taken. On the other hand, it's a suite design which clusters small numbers of rooms, 3 around a bathroom. Much less likely you're going to get the toilet when you need it. On the other hand, what's the impact on human behaviour? Really quite significant. People who live in the corridor design basically end up disliking each other. The groups who come in together are much less likely to stay together in the year following. The academic performance is slightly worse than in the suite design. What's really remarkable is these patterns of behaviour generalise somewhere else. So if you take someone from one of these students from these different kind of corridors and you put them in a different environment, it's the classic psychology experiment, happens in the waiting room, obviously. So you see how far apart people sit from others. People from the corridor design, the students will sit further away from each other. They'll avoid eye contact to a larger extent. And in the subsequent exercise, they engage in more conflictual activities. Why is that? Because in the corridor, you can't control your social interaction. You're going to open the door. If you think there might be 40 or 50 people, chances are one of them you're going to really dislike. So what do? You adapt a strategy of avoidance and withdrawal of other people. Whereas in the suite design, you've got much more control of your social interaction. So even the physical environment affects how we interact with others in ways which are predictable and we could do something about. So just kind of really drive to conclusion now. One of the most powerful things I think about the well-being data is not for governments directly to try and figure out how to make everyone happy, but it's to help people make better choices in the words of that coalition agreement. So one of the most interesting things from that ONS well-being data is just to give it back to citizens. So here's a simple plot showing life satisfaction for different occupations in the UK against earnings. Now my kids are 17, 9 and 19. It seems to me it's a pretty useful thing for them to know making a decision in life. Not just how much will they earn if they become a psychiatrist or something else, but also what's life satisfaction associated with it. Why wouldn't we shroud that and help people make better choices? In fact, you can see, as it was picked up at the time, don't go running a pub. That's a pretty miserable business. It might be fun to go there. On the other hand, look at this smaller contrast actually between medical practitioners and lawyers. It's something you might feel good about, hopefully. So lawyers do earn more than you guys, I'm sorry, on average than clinicians. On the other hand, you have significantly higher life satisfaction. Why shouldn't that be available to help guide people's choice? And that could be true in many areas of markets and choices that we make, where we mispredict what will make us happy. We at least can learn from the experiences of others. So in conclusion, when we started this thing in 2010, everybody did think it was a bit nuts. Maybe a few people still do. These are some of the headlines, and within Whitehall, reactions are pretty much the same. But as we started to do the results and prompt people to pay their taxes on time and other kind of things, might seem so important to you, but matter a lot to people in government, we got very different kinds of reactions. These were the headlines as the results started to come through. So in sum, I think we know something that we've known long already, but we can use behavioural insights and more realistic models of human behaviour in loads and loads of ways. Lots of the details of how we design our practices, be it in clinical form or as policymakers, are hugely consequential, much more than perhaps we realise. It will sometimes take us to fundamentally different policies too, in terms of how we regulate markets or how we get patients to support each other. And to me, certainly, it also has quite profound implications about what governments and indeed societies are trying to achieve in relation to what are our objectives. Is it about well-being? And the final thing perhaps about it, even if you care about the rest, it has helped to bring into policy making at the heart much more empirical methods. The use of randomized control methods and the expansion of what work centres as nice, but now in far more other areas too. So I hope that's useful to you, give you some glimpse of the world. Maybe it'll give you some encouragement that policymakers are thinking about things about the human mind and how it ticks. You can see our material, it's out there on the Behavioural Insights team, and read about what we do. Perhaps if you've got ideas, you'll also let us know, and maybe we can do something with them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. It's great to see psychology used to having such an influence on the public benefit. We have got time for one question. If anyone wants to ask a question,
No pressure, eh? Make it a good one.
It's obviously just a tiny little room. Okay, I can't see anyone. So let's just thank David again. Thank you very much.